Indian Americans have been remarkably successful. And they've done so, as I think I may have pointed out in the journal piece, without any of the advantages that come with special pleading or affirmative action or reserved places in college. And they've been pilloried by the left, who've coined this phrase, and they use it as a term of abuse. They call people from ethnic minorities who succeed in this country sneeringly model minorities, as if somehow being a model minority is like being some kind of teacher's pet. And so you're just this suck-up that does things by the book and you're successful, and you can hold down a job and you don't get divorced and your children go to university. And this somehow makes you this undesirable thing called a model minority. And somehow, if you're a minority, you have to be someone who's in trouble and who's needy and who's discriminated against and stopped by the police.
Morning, Tanku.
Morning, Larry.
How are you?
I'm terrific, thank you.
You're teaching here this week and next, I think, or last, and they tell me you're doing great, and thank you for that. You are born in India. Tell about that story. Where were you born? What'd your dad do? How'd you get here?
Yeah. It's a long story. I'm not sure it's of great interest, but I'll tell it to you anyway, the executive summary. I was born in India in 1962, which makes me 62 years old. Mm-hmm. And I was born in an army hospital in New Delhi. One of the perks of having a grandfather who was in the Indian Army, he was a colonel. But within months of being born, I was whisked off to New York City because my father, who was then a diplomat, was posted to New York, and my young mother and young father and I came to New York and lived in Manhattan in 1963. And I lived in New York for the next 6 years. So my earliest memories of life are actually American.
Huh, is that right?
Yes.
And then you went back to India. Did you live there long?
Yeah, I went back to India at the age of about 6 or 7, 6 actually, more accurately, and lived there for 10 years. Went to a boarding school in the desert state of Rajasthan, which is on the western border with Pakistan. It's like it was a Spartan place. Think Oliver Twist, where kids are expected to wear turbans. Constantly hungry, constantly made to play sport, but taught by the finest teachers that were there in India at the time. Modelled on the British system of boarding schools, a bit of Eton in the Indian desert. And at the age of 16, my father was once again transferred on a diplomatic assignment to London. And we left with him, and I went to school to do what's called the A-levels, the 2 years before college, in a school called Dulwich College in London, whose most famous alumnus is P.G. Wodehouse.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's good. Do you like P.G. Wodehouse?
I love him, and one of the things I did almost every day, to the annoyance of the college librarian, was to go to the library and press my nose against the glass case there, which housed all his artifacts, including the typewriter that he used to type all his wonderful books on.
Yeah. My friend Mark Stein, you probably know him too, is doing a series right now on his Mark Stein Club on The Girl in the Boat, a Wodehouse novel I'd never heard of before.
I haven't heard of it either.
Yeah, it's Mark makes everything interesting, and Wodehouse is always interesting, and so it's hilarious and great.
Wodehouse is maybe the most popular British author in India to this day.
To this day?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And the Indians constantly go to Britain and are disappointed that people aren't like Bertie Wooster.
Yeah. One of my great teachers in life loved Wodehouse, and he used to give as an example, you have to learn to write, he would say. For example, this sentence from Wodehouse, he dropped an astonished piece of toast. You have to know what's wrong with that to know that it's funny. Yeah. Okay, and then you stayed in England for higher education.
Yeah, I stayed there for the next 20 years, and that included a bit of higher education. I went to Oxford, where I read law, and then I stayed on at the college, which I went to Trinity College, Oxford, and taught law there too for 5 or 6 years as a fellow of the college. Before becoming a journalist at the age of 30, I joined the London Times as a leader writer, or editorial writer, as you'd say in America.
And you didn't become a lawyer, a practicing lawyer.
I did not. I sometimes, when I look at my bank balance these days, I sometimes regret not having done that. It would have been nicer to be a prosperous lawyer than a penniless journalist, but the answer is no. I was never attracted to the practice of the law. I was attracted to law as a kind of intellectual challenge, and as a subject worthy of study and thought, but the practice of it never did anything for me.
Yeah, me too.
I would have made a terrible lawyer, I think.
I wonder. I will tell our listeners that I know Tunku pretty well and have a sense of his ways and manners. And he's an interesting mixture of insightfulness and gentlemanliness.
Well, thank you.
That means you don't put much past him.
Right.
And when he catches you doing something stupid, he's usually courteous about it.
I think I would have lost my temper in court, and I don't think the judges would have liked that.
You taught there. You taught law.
Yes.
And you have said to me, you miss teaching. You're going to do some of it here. I'm very proud to announce to the world. You're doing it now, but you're going to do some more, I think. And
well, thank you.
Yeah, I think
I'd love that.
I think you're good at that. Why journalism? What is journalism, and why do you like it?
Yeah. Well, I stumbled into journalism by accident. I happened to meet and sit next to dinner, sit alongside the editor of my newspaper, and we ended up becoming friends, and I got a job at the Times of London. Why journalism? I always have liked to write, and one of the good things about an Oxford education, at least as it used to be, I don't know what it's like these days, is that we had to do an awful lot of writing. We had to write an essay almost weekly, and sometimes more frequently than that. I think we ended up writing about 6 essays a month, which we then had to read aloud in tutorial to our tutors. And so this encouraged not just the art of writing well, but the art of writing entertainingly. You had to make sure you didn't put your teacher to sleep and your tutorial partner to sleep. And so I loved writing, and when I knew that I didn't ever want to practice law, and that teaching law at Oxford was something that it was losing a little bit of its charm for me. I wanted to go out and see the big wide world, and London was just an hour and a half away by bus, and so I decided at one point that I needed to leave and go to London, make some money, do something worldly instead of teaching Roman law to undergraduates. And so I thought journalism would be just the right thing. It was a time when it was a time of ferment in the world. It was the early 90s. We were on the cusp of various changes. Britain was starting to emerge from its Thatcherite period into something less desirable. And so it was a good time to be a journalist, I thought. And
Soviet Union fell not long before that.
Exactly.
Yeah, we're going to talk about these times. It is interesting, if you go back through the decades that you've been in journalism, it's hard to find a calm time. It's
yeah, there's. I think if I rack my brain, I find a calm time, but I don't think journalists don't like calm times. You want there to be something happening out there. You want people to be miserable. I mean that in the nicest possible way. But froth and ferment and turbulence are always much more interesting than placid waters.
Mm. Well, you've come into the trade at a good time. And how did you get to the Wall Street Journal?
Well, I was in New York as the London Times' bureau chief, and I'd done that job for 3 years. And when it was time to go back to London, because they like to rotate their journalists out of jobs, they don't want them to go native. It was time for me to go, and by then I had met and married an American woman. Her name is Amy, and her parents were from North Carolina, and she did not want to, and actually could not move to London with me. So I had to decide whether to move back to London without her, which was obviously not an option, or to stay in New York and find another job. And fortunately, I had some connections to the late and great Robert Bartley.
Friend of mine, yeah.
One of the finest American journalists of all time. And he knew me and had some sense of my paltry abilities and was kind enough to offer me a job on as an editor on the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal, and I started there in May of 2000.
Still there, yeah.
I actually went to him and asked him for a job, and he didn't quite. Fortunately, he didn't swat me away, but said, "Come to my club," which is a place called the Heights Casino in Brooklyn Heights, where he lived, and we had a beer and a pizza together one day for lunch, and. My wife very wisely had said to me, before you go, make sure you read Mr. Bartley's book called 7 Fat Years. I think that's a biblical reference.
Yeah.
And so I made sure I read the 7 Fat Years before meeting Bob Bartley. And the very first question he asked me was, have you read my book? And I could truthfully say that I had.
I'll tell you quickly, in some way, we're both discoveries of Robert Bartley. Because back in the day, when I was a kid, we'd started something called the Claremont Institute. Right. And we had a journalist from the Wall Street Journal show up one day. He just entered the office, didn't have an appointment. And there were 4 of us who ran that place, and a secretary. The secretary is the only one who knew how to work in an office. And he said, I'm James Ring Adams, and I'd like to take you to lunch. And we said, who are you? And he said, well, I'm a journalist. So he takes us to lunch, buys us all lunch. And the next week, there was a major editorial, the lead editorial for the editorial page, about us. And he checked us out. And he wrote it about an article that I had written. And it was just stunning. And that's how I got to know him. And I found out he was always on a lookout for talent. Remarkable man. I think the last event he ever did before he died of cancer was on a Hillsdale College cruise. And I was very attached to him.
Yeah.
I'm glad he hired you. Good job.
Oh, he was a lovely man. He embodied the best of Midwestern America, the values of honesty, an open mind, curiosity, hospitality, patriotism, everything. And he could write like a dream, too.
Oh, yeah, yeah. He used to always say, I think it's probably still true, ours is the only opinion page that actually sells newspapers.
Yes, that's right.
He was very proud of that.
He was fond of. We would say he needed to print that onto a T-shirt and sell it, and the journal could make a lot of money. Put it on a T-shirt, I said.
I've been reading the Wall Street Journal every day since about 1975.
Right.
Professor Jaffa, the aforementioned great teacher of mine, loved the Wall Street Journal, and it had a scam that if he got students to sign up at student rates, he got a free thing. And so I was under pressure, and I started reading it and never stopped. Let's talk about the world. What is the job of a journalist? How would you describe that?
Well, there are various kinds of journalists. My kind is the opinion kind. So I think the job of a journalist who works in the opinion sphere is to look at the world or some portion of it. And the portions can be, massive, or they can be microscopic slices of life. And to tell the reader honestly and in clear language what is happening, why it's happening, to whom are things happening, should they be happening. It's to describe what he sees as honestly and helpfully, and as helpfully as possible. I'm sorry, this is a very vague and hypothetical answer, but it's sort of what journalists of my kind have to do. And be explainers, informers, entertainers, all at the same time.
Yeah. It comes from a word that means day, right? What's going on today.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a passage. I read 7 or 8 of your articles this morning. I read you every time you appear in the journal for years now.
Thank you.
And here's a tutorial, in my opinion, about how to start an article. This is about a man named Tony Abbott. It's really about China, and it's about the West. And nobody ever heard of Tony Abbott. He's an Australian. Starts, Americans dispirited by the 2024 presidential campaign, you write this in April of last year, might find it bracing to listen to Tony Abbott. Then a quote from him. The Western world has never been more materially rich, but it's rarely been more spiritually bereft. Now, there's a mountain of information in those 3 sentences. And it looks to me like you have a gift. And I because I read a bunch of them in a row this morning, they're all like that. That is to say, they're engaging from the start. They have a sense of who the audience is. And the first thing you tell them is why they might be interested in this.
Yeah.
So that's,
Well, I think that's the fundamental, the point of fundamental importance in any piece of writing for a newspaper is to make sure that the lead, as we call it, and we spell it eccentrically, L-E-D-E, for reasons that I still don't quite understand, that the lead be arresting and also hook the reader as quickly as possible. Because the reader's time is precious, you have no lien on it. The reader is free to stop reading you at any time he wants, and so you've got to make sure he continues to read you. So
Yeah. That's good.
So grab him by the collar.
This Tony Abbott article, Australia's out there in Asia, and China is near, and it's about China. You've written several articles lately that go into the question of China. What do you make of China? What do you think's going on?
Yeah. It's a good question. I don't really have a handle on China. I write about many things, and China is one of them. But Tony Abbott, since you brought him up, is a very interesting way to look at China through his eyes. He was the Prime Minister of Australia. Unfortunately, only for one term. He would have. I would have liked to have seen him be Prime Minister for much longer. He was in the sort of Thatcher Reagan mold, maybe even more muscular than that in his beliefs and his conservatism. And he had no illusions about China. He thought one of his predecessors, Kevin Rudd, who took Australia very close to China, was a sort of panda hugger, as he called him. He asked me not to put that in the piece, but I shouldn't have said it.
Yeah.
But he'll forgive me for saying it. So he had no illusions about China. He thought of China as a threat, but not a threat that one can wish away. It's a threat that is in danger of consuming the world as we know it, supplanting our values as we know them, and yet something that we have to learn to live with. So he always felt, and this is the view that I subscribe to as well, which is that China has to be managed in ways that ensure that it doesn't endanger us, and also in ways that ensure that we don't sacrifice any of our fundamental values. We mustn't sell our souls in order to be on the right side of China. But we have to learn how to live with them. So China management, there should be a course in all colleges called China management. But
yeah, that might be a course in strategy.
And Tony Abbott would be a wonderful guest to have at Hillsdale, I would say. He would.
What's he doing now? Do you know?
He is. He's a sort of sage about. He's a sort of world trotting, globe trotting sage. He runs a think tank in Australia whose name escapes me. And so I think he's based in Brisbane or Sydney, but travels the world, putting out the message of what the West should be doing and what it shouldn't be doing?
It's questions like manufacturing. Can we manufacture things we need if we have to fight, and things we need generally? There's a amazing ferment in America about all that right now.
Yeah. Well, we've hollowed out our manufacturing. I'm not an economist. I would like people to know that. But I do know as a citizen and as a journalist that we've hollowed out our manufacturing to an alarming extent. There are many things that we no longer make and possibly no longer can make if we had to make them. And so, I don't know, is it good for a society to be a society which has to import virtually everything that its people need to live? Yes, economists argue that there's a kind of Adam Smithian equilibrium that emerges, and everything is ultimately, if you conduct trade in a rational way, everything ultimately comes to be priced right for the consumer. But when things get pear-shaped, and when conflict emerges in the world, and the exchange of goods and services becomes difficult, when there are bottlenecks and pandemics and you can't get things as quickly as you need them, you have to maybe rethink some of the conventional economic positions. I would love to read a smart economist who repurposes Adam Smith for the modern world.
There's one within 200 yards of where we sit, Charles Steele. Several of them are in our econ department. I volunteer something about all that. I've said for decades now, Winston Churchill was a free trader. Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, James Madison were protectionists. Alexander Hamilton. The natural law does not speak to me on this question. There are examples on both sides. What Charles Steele will say is Smith himself explained that you have to make vital things for your country. You have to make sure of that. I was privileged to know Milton Friedman for more than 30 years. And it was a great thing to know him if you weren't his student, because he was very tough with his students. He was hilarious and mean and, great man, very great man. And we once talked for 2 hours about free trade. And I said, yeah, that's all dispositive, right? It's like the division of labor. If it's a good thing for somebody to make this cup and somebody else to make this microphone and then trade, then globally is obviously better. He'd say, so you got the point. And I'd say, yeah, I think we should extend it. We should get the Soviet Union to make our missiles and bombs, because they're really good at it and seem to do it cheaper than we do. And he said, yeah, you can't do that. And I said, that's a mouthful, isn't it? There's some qualification on the principle of free trade by the existence of national borders.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's...
Well, he was a great man, Milton Friedman. I had the opportunity. I used to be at the Hoover Institution, where he was one of the presiding deities, and I remember interviewing him in one of the earliest weekend interviews that we did at the Wall Street Journal back in, it would have been 2006. So I had, it was one of the interviews I did that I'm most proud of, because it was a tough job. I sat down to interview Milton, and just as we were, getting into our stride, his door swings open, and his wife, Rose, walks in, who's also an economist and a very feisty old lady. And she then said, I see you're interviewing Milton. I'll just sit in a corner and listen. But she didn't do that. She sat in a corner and proceeded to interrupt every time Milton said something that she disagreed with. And so I ended up writing an interview that said an interview with Milton and Rose Friedman.
I once sat beside her while he was giving a lecture, and she was talking quietly under her breath.
Yes.
And she would say something like, at one point, he was talking about sumptuary taxes on luxuries. And she goes, now mention cigarettes. And I could barely hear her. I was right next to him. And he goes, and the example of cigarettes, he says immediately. I think they might have just been one mind, those two.
Yeah, no, they were. I think they wrote a book together called A Very Happy Couple or something like that. I can't remember the name, but that phrase captures it. And this interview, which was intended as an interview with an economist to be about economics and political economy, ended up being an interview that was a portrait of a marriage, and clearly that the chemistry between them, intellectual, was perfect.
Yeah, they were two little short people.
They were.
This I don't know if people know, but they should read the April 26th article by you in the Wall Street Journal to show that the horse is an incredibly important thing in human history. Something I didn't know.
Saddle up.
Yeah, there you go. That's amazing.
That was a book review. It was a book by someone called David Chaffetz, who's written this book. Apparently, how the horse has shaped human civilization, and he makes a very convincing and attractive case for how the horse is among the 5 or 6 most important things in human civilization.
Amazing, yeah, and ends up with Genghis Khan, right?
Yeah, if you get the horse in the wrong hands, yes, or had the wrong bottom on a horse.
Yeah, one of the claims in the book that you review is that the Silk Road might have been called the Horse Road because what the Chinese needed to export silk for was to get horses.
Right.
And they were apparently, the Mongols were the ones who were really good at making them and breeding them and raising them. And then they substituted tea for silk.
Yes.
And the next thing you know, you got the Boston Tea Party.
Yes, exactly.
I want to talk about Europe. You've written a couple of articles about populists in Europe. Explain what's going on there.
Well, a lot of things are happening in Europe, and some of them mirror the things that are happening in this country. But just as we've had here with the emergence of Mr. Trump, we've had the emergence in many, if not most, European countries of populist parties. Given the political arrangements there, they tend to be parties that emerge rather than figures, the way Mr. Trump has emerged as a figure here. I don't see him as a party person. But in Europe, you've had the emergence of populist parties, populist nationalist, populist conservative, call them what you will. The preferred phrase for the mainstream media has been to call them far-right or extreme-right parties, a phrase I try to avoid because even though they are often to the right of the conventional conservative parties, the phrase far-right or extreme-right is intended almost always to disqualify them as participants in polite society, as to typecast them somehow as disagreeable people with whom we shouldn't have any contact. I was recently in Berlin, where I met one of the senior leaders of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, Alternative for Deutschland. And she was telling me, she was a woman called Beatrix von Storch. She should really, in another era, would have been a princess. She's a scion of one of the most distinguished royal houses in Germany. And she is a senior member of the AfD, and she was describing to me how the German media anathematizes the AfD, how the German media shuns the AfD, how it begins by typecasting them as Nazis, and having done so makes them ineligible for polite society and discourse. And so shuts them out of all debate and conversation. And this is a party for which almost a quarter of the German electorate voted in the last election. If I'm not mistaken, they finished second in the vote count behind the Christian Democrats. Now, I'm not saying that there are no members of the AFD who are disagreeable and who are people we wouldn't want our daughters to bring home for dinner. But to say that because of the presence of a handful of Nazis in the AFD, or neo-Nazis, call them what you will, the entire party is somehow stigmatized and untouchable is all too convenient for people who want to continue to manage European politics and discourse in a particular preordained way. And so you have this situation. J.D. Vance spoke out against it at the Munich Security Conference, that it is startling to an American to see a political system that basically treats as outcasts a party that represents a quarter of the population. How can you describe something that is representing a quarter of the population as extreme? That means a quarter of your population is extreme. What does extreme even mean, and what does mainstream mean? Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. But
in those proportional representation systems, the most popular parties might get a third.
Yeah.
So a quarter is a lot.
A quarter is a lot.
And we have some of that here too. Views censored on social media and in the big press. I've always thought, like my affection for the newspaper you write for, which, like everybody, I don't regard anything else as wholly reliable, but it's the most. And I always thought, I think Bob Bartley understood this too. It's a place to go where you won't read the same thing you read everywhere else, and that the only you could achieve that effect by reading everything else and just writing something different, which is not what you do. He thought, go look at the phenomenon and describe it as it is, and don't worry what anybody else is saying about it. And your articles on, you got one on Nigel Farage in here, and Marine Le Pen has now been. Marine Le Pen is she the most popular politician in France? She might be.
Well, I don't know where things stand now, but she is. She gave Macron a run for his money. She was one of She was one of two presidential candidates in the runoff. So that makes her, if not the most popular politician, then an undeniably significant one.
And she's been convicted of a crime. And the crime is she used staff provided for the European Union when she was a member of the European Parliament for non-European Union tasks. And she's excluded from politics. So whatever percentage of the vote she got, they don't have her to vote for anymore.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with all the details of the Marine Le Pen case. I've been in Hillsdale busy teaching, but it does strike me as being all too convenient for the French political elites and the French quote unquote mainstream to find this lovely, wonderful technicality on which to disqualify the one politician that poses a threat to the status quo. You may find Marine Le Pen not to your taste. You may find her unsavory, but ultimately you have to let the French people decide whether or not they want her to be president, not get rid of her based on some kind of all too convenient technicality, which seems to have been the case.
I watched both the Vance speeches, the one on artificial intelligence and the one on security in Europe. And in both speeches, they showed the audience a lot. And my perception was in the first speech where he said we have to embrace AI as a major opportunity and protect the workers while we do it. They seemed stiff to me, not friendly. The second one, there were open restiveness in the crowd. And he started out, he said, you got to spend 5% of your GDP on defense. And he said that for about 3 or 4 minutes. And then he turned to suppressing speech and excluding political parties. And there was, in the room, there were gasps and people putting their head in their hands, and a very strong reaction after.
Yeah.
And so that makes me think, if you put that together with these people you've interviewed, is Europe becoming illiberal?
Well, European politics has always been the exclusive preserve of sort of preordained political elites who've managed over the years to sort of domesticate the system and domesticate the horse, as it were, of politics and make sure that it rides in one direction. It doesn't rear its legs. It doesn't gallop. It just runs at a reliable trot in a reliable direction. But we've now reached a stage where the horse, as it were, let's say the horse are the people of the countries that they govern, the horse has decided that it doesn't want to just trot, and it doesn't want to just go in a preordained direction. It wants to explore fresh pastures. It likes the look of the grass over there. It doesn't want to eat the grass in that on the left. It wants to eat the grass on the right. And so they're having trouble managing the horse. And so I think we're in a situation where European politics is being remade. The elites are losing their grip on the reins. And so as a result, I'm running out of horse vocabulary now, but whatever it is you use to hit the horse to calm it down,
Crop.
The crop. They're having to use the crop a little more than they did in the past because the horse is starting to disobey them. And so yes, this illiberalism that we see in the form of the disqualification of Ms. Le Pen, or the shunning of the AfD, or the disqualification of the presidential candidate in Romania, which is what sparked Mr. Vance's talk, is the equivalent of the elite, the rider using the crop, and the horse doesn't like it. So I think we need to. I think we're watching European politics being remade as we speak. You see it in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders. You see it in some form in Britain with Nigel Farage's prominence, although Britain is an altogether different picture now because they got the horse, as it were, got its yayas out by winning Brexit. If Britain was still in Europe, we might have seen the emergence of a more populist party there, which would be pushing for the same aims that Brexit achieved. But Brexit, in a way, happened. It ended up effectively killing off the Democratic Party, the Conservative Party, and because the Conservative Party, having delivered Brexit, was unsure of what to do with it, and they were unprepared for victory, and their heart didn't seem to be in concluding a deal with Europe that would have brought Britain what it had voted for. But to return to your original question, we're seeing a remaking of politics in Europe that will throw up surprises. I think we're going to see the emergence of new leaders who say uncomfortable things, things that we're not used to hearing. A bit like Mr. Trump here, who's saying things that Americans are not used to hearing. And it's a question of attuning your ear to new sounds and your heart to new disturbances.
Decision pending. I wonder if you think it means in American politics, there's a fair amount of dysfunction.
Yes.
The government has enormous resources, state, federal, and local, more than ever, and it can't build the bridges, keep the military up to date, secure the streets. And in Europe, they're light years from being able to defend themselves. And Mr. Trump is confronting them with that problem, and one wonders, what are they going to do? So there's this dysfunction that seems to have spread everywhere. And meanwhile, China seems very strong and growing. Does that mean that there's been some disproof of the Western liberal forms?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I know that Messrs. Trump and Vance, in insisting to Europe that they fulfill their spending obligations under the NATO treaty, and sometimes even to exceed those obligations, have, I think, helped or caused the European mind to concentrate on the task. You've seen the Germans, for instance, are beginning to realize that they need to do something about defense spending. And so, they even went to the extent of remaking, lifting the brake on spending to allow going into debt for defense spending. It was one of the things. I don't know whether they finally pulled it off, but they are taking every legal measure and constitutional measure possible to increase spending so that they can meet their NATO obligations, because the incoming chancellor, or the presumptive incoming chancellor, Mr. Merz, I think understands, however obtuse he may be, and I do think he is obtuse, understands that the days of free riding on the United States are probably over. And that the Germans, if they wish to defend themselves, and it's not entirely clear always that the Germans wish to defend themselves, because they've been caught in this kind of cozy condition for a generation or longer, where their defense needs have been taken care of by Mama America, and have been able to spend their own largesse on building what is a very comfortable welfare state. But I think they're now realizing that all this their way of life and their way of spending is threatened. But you have examples. The Poles already meet the obligations. But I think Europeans in general will have arrived at a time of reckoning. I think they know that they either defend themselves with their own money, or they leave themselves vulnerable to attack from, I guess, Russia is the country that we feel is the greatest threat to them. But yeah, it's all part of the remaking of European politics.
Immigration plays into this in big ways. What do you make of that? Why is it an acute issue, and what do you think will happen?
In Europe or worldwide?
It's kind of worldwide, isn't it?
Yeah, I think immigration is a big problem. I think it's a bigger problem in Europe than it is in the United States. I think the U.S. clearly does have its problem with illegal immigration. But it's a bigger country than any European country. It has much better absorptive capacities demographically. It has more place in which to put people, in other words. And many of the immigrants who are coming to America from the biggest liability of many of the immigrants coming to America from the southern countries, Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, etc., are that they are poor, unskilled, and speak a different language. But for the most part, culturally, they're Christian. So they are ultimately assimilable in this society. Once they learn English, once they acquire skills, once they learn how to do things, pay taxes, not commit crime, and live life in something resembling the American way, they are ultimately assimilable. Yes, in their midst come various bad guys like the Tren de Aragua from Venezuela and various criminal syndicates. But for the most part, these are just desperate poor people who are coming for a better life, coming the wrong way. They shouldn't be breaking the law and coming to this country, but we know why they're coming. In Europe, yes, a lot of the motivations to move from Morocco or Syria or Afghanistan to Europe are similar. They're poor people caught in the crossfire of tensions and wars who want to live comfortable, safe lives in Europe. But the difference between an Afghan and a Moroccan and a Syrian on the one hand and a Mexican on the other is that these first people that I mentioned are much more difficult to assimilate because they come with a culture that is that has historically been at loggerheads with the Judeo-Christian culture of Europe. And so it isn't just a question of teaching the Syrian French or teaching the Afghan German or teaching the Moroccan Italian or Spanish. It's a question of teaching them how to live in societies that are tolerant, that are based on Judeo-Christian values, that are based on certain levels of respect for women, for the community, for public spaces, for ways of eating and dressing and speaking and reading and thinking. And so it's much harder to assimilate these, I think, often essentially unassimilable people. And so you have to manage them. And it's the management of them that's so difficult, especially when in these countries there is a progressive predisposition to regard their cultures, the cultures of these incoming people, as being of equal value to the culture of the host country. It's all very nice to say so. It's all very nice to say, oh, all countries are wonderful and let's all live together. But it doesn't work out that way in real life. And some cultures are not of equal value to others. And we have to, we've lost sight of the belief that our culture, and it must seem strange to see an Indian refer to Western culture as our culture, but I've been an assimilated citizen of the West.
You've written a column lately about the success of immigrants from India to America.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, they have been remarkably successful. They're just 1.5% of the population. That's about 5 million people. They've ascended to positions of power, particularly as business CEOs, as doctors, as business school deans, lawyers. And the most impactful and eye-catching presence of Indian Americans has of late been in politics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We had 2 Indian Americans compete for the the Republican candidacy for president. You had Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. You had the Democratic candidate who ran against Mr. Trump, Kamala Harris, as the daughter of an Indian mother. I know she positioned herself publicly as an African American, but she's the child of an Indian mother, and she was raised almost exclusively by that Indian mother, and had quite an Indian upbringing until it became politically expedient for her to rebrand herself, and who can blame her there? And I think
advantages of the melting pot.
Exactly. But so yes, Indian Americans have been remarkably successful. And they've done so, as I think I may have pointed out in the journal piece, without any of the advantages that come with special pleading or affirmative action or reserved places in college. In fact, until the Supreme Court ruling on the affirmative action case, it was probably a disadvantage to be an Indian applicant to an Ivy League school, the same way it was a disadvantage to be a Chinese applicant. So yes, I think it's and they've assimilated better than others. They've maintained the core of their own culture, but they've also learned that in order to be successful in America, you have to play by America's rules, speak America's language, not necessarily eat America's food. I still applaud them for eating Indian food at home, but I think they've been pilloried by the left, who've coined this phrase, and they use it as a term of abuse. They call people from ethnic minorities who succeed in this country sneeringly model minorities, as if somehow being a model minority is like being some kind of teacher's pet. And so you're just this suck-up that does things by the book and you're successful, and you can hold down a job and you don't get divorced and your children go to university. And this somehow makes you this undesirable thing called a model minority. And somehow, if you're a minority, you have to be someone who's in trouble and who's needy and who's discriminated against and stopped by the police. And
and then if you are, then I can get a lot of power by claiming to help you out.
Exactly.
But what about, so these Muslims who have come to Europe are hard to assimilate, and the Indians who've come to America, who aren't as numerous, but still have been easier to assimilate. Is something about Indian culture there that makes that so?
Well, I think, Indian culture is very different from Middle Eastern culture. It's very different from, and the Indians who come to this country are, in the majority, Hindus. But I would wager that even Indian Muslims have assimilated well in this country. So there's something about the Indian... I think Indian culture in a way transcends religion. You know, Indian Muslims and Indian Hindus have a lot more in common than Indian Muslims have with Syrian Muslims. I think the Syrian Muslim and the Indian Muslim have the fact that they're both adherents to the Islamic faith in common, but beyond that, they have very little in common. They may fast during the month of Ramadan, but that's part of the Islamic tradition. But they have other things, you know, they treat women differently. We're talking about the educated class of Indian Muslim, not all the way down the line, but the same is true also for Hindus. We're talking about educated Hindus. So the Indian Muslim who emigrates to this country is likely to have been to an Indian university where he's had a kind of education that isn't exclusively religious, where he studied science and where he studied literature and where he studied the Constitution and has some sense of things beyond religion. But I think it's important. One of the things that it's most important to stress is, of course, that Indian immigrants to this country often come armed with the English language. They may speak it with an accent that is sometimes hard to understand, that sometimes requires subtitles. But they can read it perfectly well and they can write it reasonably well and ultimately get to speak it with an American accent if they've lived here long enough. And so I think they're just much more easily assimilable because they're in the main... There's nothing in their cultural package, in their cultural baggage, that leads them to resist America. They're not inherent resistors the way that a Moroccan immigrant to Germany would be an inherent resistor. He'd worry about his daughter going to school. He'd worry about his wife going to the market by herself. He'd worry about the way people dress. And whether, he'd worry about all the fundamental things that German citizens do that would require him to assimilate to norms that are inimical or hostile to his own norms. Indian immigrants in the United States don't have those problems in the main.
And India itself, I'm an expert on India. I've been there once for 10 days, which means I spent 1 second there for every Indian probably. But I know something about Winston Churchill, and I think there was a place where he was right and a place where he was wrong. And it's rare for me to say that Churchill was wrong about something. I think there is an India. Churchill thought that there could be an India, but he thought in his day that there was not one, that it would break into 1,000 pieces the British left. It broke into 3. So I think he was wrong about that. But I'll tell a quick story. So we were having dinner one night when I was over there. I hung out with education people. They offered me an award, and I always wanted to go to India, so I thought, here's an excuse. And so we got into it.
Never turned out an award.
Yeah, I'm older than you are. You get more as you get older.
Yes.
But we're sitting around dinner, and of course, everybody is terribly courteous. India's a charming place. Very different, too. But my hostess, in a very charming way, said, Winston Churchill starved to death 3.5 million people in Bengal in the Second World War. And she said it sort of kindly and not really to confront me. And I happen to know about that. I actually had a debate with the lady who wrote the book that claimed that, a lady named Mukherjee. And she's just wrong about every basic fact. And so I said, well, that's not true. And so we talked about it for 20 minutes, and everybody was very polite and impressed that, turned out it isn't true. And then I said, I picked up in the last couple of days, many of you like Mr. Modi, and many of you don't. Modi is the current ruler of India. And they nodded their head, and I said, how did he get that job? And he was elected. And I said, and those of you who'd like to get him out, how will you get him out? And I said, Britain have anything to do with that being the way here in India? And they go, my host, I had a host and a hostess, a married couple, and the host is named Dilip Thakur, really great guy. And he's educated at Balliol College in law. And he said, yes, he said, we have said that. In other words, the British weren't all bad. And I think in the 1930s, it was Lord Halifax and Stanley Baldwin who drove the first big step toward Indian independence. And they eventually got that, 1934, 1948, 24 years, 14 years later, not very long. And they may have been right about that. But Churchill was partly right, because there were about 1 million people killed when the British left in the Civil War. So anyway, and India is important. I'd like to ask you about that. It seems to me India is the most populous country. It's governed through elections. They have freedom of speech, and they're young, and they're going to be the most populous country for a long time. Are they important, and how should we regard them?
Yeah. India is a big deal. I just wanted to say a couple of things about Churchill before I talk, and if you'll permit me. I agree with you. I think people misread the Bengal famine. I think Andrew Roberts in his biography puts that canard to rest. So any of your viewers who want to know about the truth about the Bengal famine should read Andrew Roberts' biography of Churchill. And the other thing that's said about Churchill, which is that he said that Indians were a beastly people with a beastly religion, that's never actually been accurately attributed to Churchill. It was Leo Amery who said or claimed that Churchill had said it, and we have no way of fact-checking that.
Right.
And there's every reason to believe that Churchill didn't say it. I mean, he may have said something that was less than flattering, but we don't know and can't know whether he used those precise words. But those words are often thrown at our faces as proof that Churchill. But as far as India is concerned, India is a big deal. And the more we worry about China, the bigger deal India becomes for the West, but particularly for the United States, which can't take on China alone, can't and shouldn't, and will need reliable allies who have skin in the game. And no one has more skin in the game against China than India does. It's India's northern neighbor. It has Indian territory under its control that it's taken illegally. And it's a constant source of threat and angst and danger to the Indian people, to the Indian economy, to India's territorial integrity. So for as long as Xi Jinping lives, America and India will have common cause. And certainly I agree. I think Britain, the British colonial experience in India is a complex thing. But one reason why India is a successful place today, and Indians are successful exporters of themselves, is that they are intellectually and linguistically thought. The Westminster model of democracy, the rule of law, the adoption of the common law system. Everyone talks about the railways, but these are all the railways of politics. And so they left, yes, they extract vast amounts of riches from India and to the benefit of the mother country back in Northern Europe? Sure. But it's not as if they gave the Indians in India nothing in return. And most significantly of all was their shaping of India as a kind of unitary political entity, which it had never been before. And so I think, you can detect that the colonial experience was a mixed one, in other words, not uniformly bad, by the fact that Britain and India today have very amicable relations. I think it's probably the best example of any post-colonial relationship that I can think of in the world between a former imperial power and a decolonized state. India and Britain have, maybe Brazil and Portugal are comparable, but the Portuguese left Brazil under different circumstances and much longer ago than the British left India. And so I think India needs to be paid attention to. India also needs, though, and I disagree with you slightly, we need also to continue to insist that India live up to its own highest standards. I think we often sometimes do glibly say that India is just like us, it's an ally, it has the same values, Western democracy, etc., etc. But what we've seen in the last 10 years or 15 years has been a maintenance of the forms of democracy, the forms of election, the forms of speech, the forms of litigation, but an erosion of the substance. So when you say there's free speech, yes, on paper there is, but there have been increasing instances of intolerance, of shutting down of expression and speech that wouldn't pass muster with the First Amendment in the United States. And so I think we need to, while we celebrate India and celebrate it for the values that it shares with us, we need also to ensure that India remains true to those values. That's my view.
It's very partisan now, right? I mean, Mr. Modi has remade Indian politics, but then had some setback in the most recent election. And so he lost a vote share. He now governs in a coalition where previously his party ruled on its own. He's backtracked on a few things. He's much less Thatcherite in his economic policy than he had promised to be in 2014 when he first came to power. He's much more of a crony capitalist than I would like him to be, but he's still a capitalist. Have you interviewed him?
I have not. He doesn't give time to journalists readily.
Well, if you get a chance, I hope you'll do it, because it'll be very good for me to read it.
It would be exciting. I'd love to do that. But he's reluctant. He's a reluctant interviewee.
Well, he's something else. I think there's a job for you there to explain India, because I believe very much that it's important and friendly. Yeah.
I think a point that I highlighted in my Pulliam lecture last night, though, that's something that worries me and should worry the Hillsdale family a little, is the increasing hostility towards Christians in India. It's something we need to focus on, and I think it's part of the growing consequences of assertive Hindu nationalism. So Christians, I think the Christians in India need our help.
Good. Well, you're as I said at the beginning, a gentleman and a splendid journalist, and help us to understand the world. And I am grateful to you very much for teaching here and for being on this podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Rahn.
Thank you.